story of Upbuild began in a monastery. On our quest to understand ourselves more deeply, we recognize that it is our attachment to our egos, our identities, that gets in the way of being our true selves. This podcast will help you understand your ego. It will help you better understand your inner world, the motivations, insecurities, and emotions that affect your every action and relationship. Welcome to Upbuilding the Self.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Upbuilding the Self. I am Michael Sloyer, and I am here with Rasanath and Hari Prasad. How are you doing, guys?
Good to be here with you.
Doing all right.
We often say that our podcast topics are near and dear to our hearts. But I think today this is especially near and dear to all three of our hearts because our topic is the inner critic. And I know that my inner critic runs wild. From knowing the two of you guys for the last 10 years, I know that your inner critics run wild. And so I'm really excited to talk about this topic with you today. I went through the inner critic workshop that you guys created maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And I've been through a lot of Upbuild workshops. And this one was particularly powerful for me because of how you thought about the inner critic. I've always had this sense that my inner critic's kicking my butt, but I didn't really understand it. Where is it coming from? What is it doing? There's so many nuances to it. And you both really drew that out through the workshop. And so I'm excited to share that with our audience here today.
Beautiful. Us too. Thank you.
So Hari, maybe you could get us started by sharing what is the inner critic and where does it come from?
The inner critic is this voice that is constantly telling us what we need to do and what will make us enough. We've discovered through this work over the years that the inner critic is actually the mouthpiece of the ego. So the ego, which is the identity of who we think we should be rather than who we are, that's the basis of all our work, is discovering that that's stopping us from being our best, it's stopping us from being who we actually are. Now, the inner critic is really employed by the ego to make us do what it wants so that we can have a sense of self. Like, I have an identity in the world. The critic is constantly evaluating, how am I living up to that identity? Therefore, it's the mouthpiece of the ego because it gives a voice to, am I a solid, stable identity that can be validated in the world, that I prove myself to myself? Or what will it take for me to get there? And that's the inner critic's job, is to give us that solid, stable identity in the world so we can think we are our egos rather than ourselves.
And there's a lot of suffering that comes from listening to this voice. What's going on there with the suffering?
Well, the suffering is the result of being criticized. At least that's when we recognize it. We'll talk more about this because there's a lot more to it, as you were alluding to. But the recognizable suffering is when we're being criticized by our inner critic. And it's natural that when this voice in your head that you're so closely identified with, that it comes in the mind, and 99.9% of us think we are our minds. Even if we haven't examined that belief, we act on that belief. So if I hear a voice coming from my mind and it sounds like me, I think it's me, and I identify with that, obviously, if I'm thinking it's me. So then I take it to heart. And then when it criticizes me, I'm really roughed up. So my inner critic is constantly battering me. It's beating me up from within, and I feel the pain of that.
Yeah, this was such an important point and takeaway for me from the workshop, that I am not my inner critic. We often walk around thinking, oh, I'm so hard on myself. I'm so hard on myself. And we actually believe that me, is the one being hard on myself. But what we discover is that it's not actually the real me, it's the inner critic. which is, as you said, the mouthpiece of the ego and the way that the ego communicates to us.
The other suffering that we experience in presence of the inner critic is that it's like there's this old story, I think it comes from a Buddhist tradition, where a farmer is a poor farmer. He doesn't have money. And while walking through the forest one night, a mystical being gives him 7 pots of gold. And the farmer goes home and he opens the pots and he sees that 6 of the pots are full, but the 7th pot is only half full. Then he is very bothered by the fact that it's only half full, because he was hoping that it would be 7 full pots of gold. And so he decides to fill up the pot so that he has 7 pots of gold. But that pot is such a pot that every time you pour something into it, the level doesn't increase. It stays the same. It still shows up as half a pot of gold. And this poor farmer starts to work really hard and becomes so obsessed with somehow filling that 7th pot that he loses all his happiness and his peace of mind. And then he realizes that with the 7 pots of gold, he's so much more unhappy than he was when he didn't have any of it. That is the suffering with the inner critic. There is no end. It's like that 7th pot where even if we try to live up to its expectations, we find we're always at a deficit every single time. And there is never a time where in the presence of the inner critic, we will feel like we are enough. And that creates this perpetual, the best way I can put it, it's not just circumstantial suffering, it's this perpetual suffering where we are obsessed with filling that 7th pot. And the more we try to fill that pot, the more we realize that we can never really truly fill it. That's the experience of being with the inner critic.
It's an amazing illustration, and it reminds me so much of a very similar story that my guru, Satchidananda Swami, tells about getting, let's say, $100 and then losing $1 and being obsessed that now I have $99. What happened to the $1? Like, that's not, then it's incomplete.
So I'm taking 2 things away from both of those stories is, one, we miss out on what we actually have, and we feel this perpetual feeling of not enoughness. And regardless of how much we're adding, it never actually feels complete.
Yes.
Yeah.
One of the things that was most striking from the workshop was this idea of pluses and minuses that you both brought in. And Hari, could you share a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So the inner critic is responsible for giving us our report card on how we're doing at living up to our ego. So it is always lurking and grading us. So some of us can feel like I have somebody looking over my shoulder, even when there's nobody physically present looking over my shoulder. That's the inner critic. And actually, that's happening for all of us. Some of us are aware of it, but it's happening to all of us all the time. And regardless of your personality, your nature, it's happening. So the inner critic is observing, like this critic who's prepared to dish out the plus or the minus, depending on how you do. And what's really crucial here is that we fail to recognize that the inner critic gives us good grades too. When we think inner critic, we think, oh, critic means criticize. Yes, but critic also means I evaluate, and if I think it's good, then I give it a good grade. Sometimes our inner critic is giving us 2 thumbs down, and we're recognizing that. And sometimes our inner critic says 2 thumbs up. Well done. Great job. Pat yourself on the back now. They're both coming from the inner critic. And this is one of the most important things we could possibly understand about the functioning of our inner critic. And by extension, one of the foundational pieces of understanding how our egos work.
So it's like a movie critic. If they were to give out 2 thumbs down for all movies, they wouldn't have a lot of credibility. So the inner critic actually gets its authority by giving us pluses.
That's what it is. And that's how it gets us in the game. So the plus minus game, and this is really a great credit to Don and Russ at the Enneagram Institute, who trained us in understanding the Enneagram personality typology, and with it, some of the most amazing features of the human condition. Amazing and harrowing, but amazing understanding of these features. So they really, through their own inner critic workshop, help to unpack this idea of the plus minus game and how you get into the game not by buying into the minuses, the criticisms. Because if somebody just stands around criticizing you, pretty soon you're like, oh, this person just does, this person's biased. I'm going to listen to this person. This is ridiculous. It's like when some person's out on the street shouting things, everybody just is like a little intrigued, what's wrong with this, but walk away. But when the person is praising you, and when the person gets your ear and lures you in and says, you're so wonderful. Oh, my dear Hari Prasad, you are so good. You're so good. Now it's like, oh, I like this. So I don't want to do bad. And the inner critic is evaluating, well, what's it going to be, boy? Are you going to do good or are you going to do bad?
It's dark in the sense that,
that's what I was thinking, how dark it was.
it's pretty dark, because this can easily be a movie about, abuse. And
it's a seduction. It's a seduction,
right? It is. If you really think about abuse, the person who is being abused has to stay in it. That's what we call gaslighting, right? It's a term that is very charged, and it also brings, so much anger when we realize we are being gaslit. The reason why it's so tricky is because at a certain point in time, it's very hard for me to figure out what's true, because I get the pluses, and then suddenly the same thing that gave me the pluses treats me like I am garbage on the street. And it leaves me hopelessly dependent on getting the pluses again, because I don't know where else to go. So the whole portrayal, if we truly understand what's happening, it's pretty dark. How it's a form of quote unquote self-abuse that we go through in the presence of the inner critic.
Well, that's why I quote Russ Hudson in this piece that I wrote, When Will We Stop Beating Ourselves Up, about the relationship with the inner critic, as saying, if somebody else said to you what your inner critic says, you punch that person in the face. But because it's coming from inside your own mind, you just take it. And there's another piece to that, which is that if you try to punch back, it backfires. You will just aggravate it more, because when what you resist persists, and when you start firing back at somebody, you just get into more of an altercation. So that's not the approach that we want in working with our inner critic anyway. But it's an amazing observation that we don't sometimes punch back because we think it's us, and we let ourselves, so to speak, walk all over ourselves, but it's not our real selves.
The other way the inner critic works also, and this is something that I have personally experienced, is there have been certain episodes of minus in my life that have externally happened, where people have said certain things about me that doesn't feel validating to the ego. And the inner critic keeps that alive in such a way that I have to basically work for the next 20 years in order to negate what happened. It's like filling that half pot of gold. And the inner critic can keep bringing back the same episode to show how, yeah, you did something, but they're still right. This doesn't prove anything about you. And so you're just perpetually stuck in, and this is where we also talk about stories that we live in. And the inner critic is very, very good at weaving those stories. And those stories become realities.
It's also often that 20 years is getting off easy. That's like for good behavior. The whole thing with the inner critic is to keep you in the game for life. It's a life sentence. It's that's really what it is. It's a life sentence. And a lot of these messages we start to notice getting internalized deeply from childhood. And then it's like I'm trying my entire life to negate that message, to prove that I'm enough. And that can never work.
It really feels like an addiction. Like we talk about, lots of common addictions like alcohol or drugs or gambling or any kinds of addictions that are more commonly talked about. And then here's this inner critic, which is subtly creating all of the same dynamics that are present in addictions.
Ultimately, any form of external addiction is some manifestation of the internal. And this is something that we don't necessarily fully acknowledge. I think Gabor Mate was the first person that I heard who explicitly speaks about addiction in this way, and the recognition that we are all addicts. And when it goes to an extreme, it manifests in the form of substance abuse. But the source of it all is coming from this internal addiction with the inner critic, like really desperately desiring the pluses. And then when we receive the minuses, not knowing what to do with it. Sometimes, even with the pluses, the shelf life of the pluses that we receive just ends very quickly. The dosage has to be upped. The next plus has to be bigger. That is classic addiction, right? So ultimately, any form of addiction that we see externally is coming. The source of it is our dependence, our hopeless dependence on the inner critic's judgment.
And trying to drown out the pain of it, right? The criticism is too great for me to bear. I don't feel I'm living up. And so I need to run to something that will dull the pain. And I hope will get rid of it forever. But then I need to keep doing more and more that drowns out my consciousness.
And there's the delusion that like one day I'll get to this place and that'll be enough. And I'll actually be able to not be so ensnared by the game of the inner critic. It's like I'll be successful enough, or I will be peaceful enough, whatever the fixation or the enoughness is. And the inner critic is so good at giving us enough breadcrumbs where we actually believe that that can happen.
It's a master. It's a master at work. We should never underestimate that. The inner critic has us. And the moment we think, I don't have such a big inner critic, or like, I'm doing fine. Yeah, my inner critic showed up the other day or last week or something. That's not the right understanding. That's not what's going on. That means the unconscious is running us. It's only when we see our inner critic constantly at work, it never sleeps. When we see it, that we can say, okay, now I'm doing my best to manage it.
Hari, I love when you say it's when I'm not seeing my ego, or in this case, the inner critic, that I get worried.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, I like to share that I don't celebrate when I don't see my ego. I sound the alarm, because it doesn't mean that it suddenly magically disappeared. It means that it's running me and I can't see it. It's because I'm too absorbed in it. And that's exactly what it is with the inner critic.
The other masterful skill of the inner critic is to, and this will be in varying degrees for different people, depending on wiring, but it also makes us believe that we need it in order to get what we want. So you'll hear a lot of people, myself included, who are like, the inner critic is just like this price I have to pay for success. Or it's like, I don't love that it beats me up, but if I didn't have it, like that alternative seems way worse than just dealing with this suffering that I'm dealing with, because it's actually pushing me to where I want to go. So how can we respond to that?
It's classic inception, I would say. from the movie itself. The story about, well, I want the success itself is a creation of the inner critic, right? The feeling that I'm not enough, and then giving me it's what can I say? The best comparison I can give is the world of advertising. And one of the things that the world of advertising truly banks on is when somebody doesn't have a need, you first create the need, because otherwise, how will you sell the product? So the inner critic is master at doing that. It creates the, and again, understand that the inner critic is the voice of the ego. The ego is not the true self. So for the ego to exist, it requires a certain kind of mission. The ego creates a story that you should be this and you're not. And as soon as that is the premise of everything, then we are dependent on the inner critic, because only the critic can show us the way.
Well, the other way not to respond to the inner critic, not to respond, is the very popular self-help pep talk, pump myself up, motivational pep talks with myself, where I'm like, hey, Prasad, you're amazing. You're so good. You can do it. If I'm having to do that, it's because my inner critic is saying, right, Prasad, you're not enough. No, I am enough. I'm so good. I can do it. I can do it. I can do it. I would never need to prove myself in that way and to pump myself in this artificial manner if I wasn't feeling insecure. And if I'm feeling insecure, it's because my inner critic is telling me I'm not enough. That's the source of all insecurity. That's it. So it is not a solution to say, you can do it. You're going to go out and kill it. You're amazing. You're awesome. You got this. That is just taking the inner critic's message and obeying it as a slave, but trying to counter it with positivity. But you're still in the game. You're basically just trying to give yourself the pluses and hope that the inner critic accepts it and that you're louder. But the inner critic is smiling like, you're just doing exactly what I'm here to do. So go for it, knock yourself out. It will never be enough. You'll never be able to sustain that. And deep down, you're just trying to prove yourself. You're feeling insecure and you're trying to prove yourself. 24/7, you're going to live your life pumping yourself up and trying to prove yourself. Go for it.
So another maxim from the advertising world is you got to create the pain and then people will buy the product. I think we've done a pretty good job at creating the pain here. I'm feeling this is painful. And I hope our listeners are feeling the same. If we're really deeply introspective about what's going on in our life, and we're talking in generalities here for the most part, but each of us have a specific way or specific type of words and specific story that the inner critic mostly communicates with us by. And so one of the things that I would urge is for each person listening to try to get in touch with that and really see how what we're speaking about with the inner critic inflating and egging on and minimizing, and how all of these three things are at work at the same time, and how that directly applies to your own experience.
Yeah, for me, the repeated message, because this you'll get this a lot, as you're saying, the repeated messages, and it tailors to the context. So it tailors to your personality and it tailors to the context. So for me, repeated messages are, you're not going to be able to make it through the day. You have too many responsibilities. You'll never be able to do it. Therefore, you're failing. You're failing at your day and you're failing at your life because it's always the same story. You just can't do it, Hari Prasad. You're failing. And you're not able to do enough for your wife. You're not able to do enough for your work and for your loved ones, your community. It's just never enough. So spend another day in that mode and try to prove yourself. But I've got the reins, it's not enough.
Thank you for sharing.
And this is also something that needs to be acknowledged, that when we truly try to understand the voice of the inner critic, it's not that it's completely false, but there is truth to it. Yes, sometimes we cannot meet expectations that people have of us. And sometimes consistently, we're not able to meet the expectations that someone has of us. The challenge is the conclusions that we come to. So if I am not able to meet this expectation, therefore I must be, right? And that I must be is so antithetical to what the ego thinks it should be that now we are on our way to proving that the inner critic is wrong. So it's not that the inner critic is false, like it's only telling us lies. It's using truth to help us address it. But the way it's asking us to address it is what really makes it so messy. It's like quicksand.
This is why in our workshop, and it's a whole subject of working with the inner critic, we really ask people to parse out the truth from their inner critic messages and see what would be helpful for me to acknowledge and work with versus what is an exaggeration, an inaccuracy, just a deep fear that's playing on me that has no basis in reality. And then we're in a much more grounded place. I mean, I can't emphasize enough how important that practice is and how powerful it is for working with the inner critic. It's just that, if we throw the baby out with the bathwater, as Rasanath, you're talking about, like pretending that it's all false, then the inner critic's going to be like, aha, not so easy, because deep down, what I'm saying is true. So I will always be nagging. I will always be nagging. You know that what I'm saying is true. You can't dismiss me like that.
You can keep ignoring, you're just fooling yourself.
And look, this person noticed it. This person just gave you my message that I've been giving you my whole life. See?
How far will you run, right? And the strength of parsing the truth. So first of all, when we do understand that the inner critic is running on some truth, and we take the responsibility of understanding what the truth is, one, we stand and we face the inner critic rather than subject ourselves to its demands. Number two, when we do ultimately look at what truth the inner critic is trying to point and acknowledge and accept it, it always inevitably transforms into humility. And the thing with the only true antidote to the inner critic is humility. Like, what can you do to a humble person? You can't really do anything to a humble, like you can't egg a humble person on because the person is just humble. And the analogy that one of the verses that my guru often quotes to depict humility is the blade of grass. And the way he talks about it is that when you step on a blade of grass, it just bends and then it just comes back. There is no other reaction really. And that's a very humble person. A humble person, a humble person has accepted what is true and lives his real life aligned to what is true. And when we can do that, then the inner critic just loses its power, really. So the reason why I bring this up is it's very important to understand that the only way that we can truly work with the inner critic is by the gradual development of true humility.
What you're referring to, Rasanath, is a verse from the sacred texts in the yoga tradition about being more humble than a blade of grass as an instruction to overcome the ego and become self. Be more humble than a blade of grass.
Yeah, that's right.
So now that you've given a more hopeful message, I was feeling some lack of courage before, but now I think it's okay to step into this, given that there's some hope on the other end based on what you just shared. But Hari, when you were talking about separating the truth, understanding the truth of the inner critic, I think it'll be helpful to look at a real example. So what I'm experiencing right now is like, am I a good enough podcast host? Am I guiding my inner critic is giving me these messages, you're not guiding the discussion in the best way possible. It's also giving me some breadcrumbs of like, this podcast is pretty good. Podcasts before have gotten a lot of quality feedback and people are really liking this. So right in this moment, I'm getting actually both messages of this inflating and minimizing. So given what you shared about looking at the truth versus maybe some of the distortions of the inner critic, how might we look at this example?
So going back to what I had shared, how the podcast is really good, that must mean there is always a conclusion to it, right? And the conclusion typically is, well, people appreciated the podcast. That must mean that I am an oracle. And now that identity gets reinforced. And now when then somebody criticizes, then that must mean I'm not I'm not an oracle. So the extreme degrees to which we go is based on the conclusion that we draw from getting the pluses and the minuses. And when the pluses come, yes, it's quite possible that what was just done was excellent. But as soon as the attribution and the conclusion is, therefore, it must mean I am so good, that's where the ego hides. We can totally accept the compliment that somebody is giving and take it as an encouragement to keep doing good work without necessarily coming to a conclusion about our own self-image based on the validation or the criticism.
By the way, I cannot let this go, that the oracle is not some made-up thing. That was not just a spontaneous, spur-of-the-moment inspiration for a hypothetical. That is Rasanath's actual nickname based on actual feedback. And yeah, it's a real thing.
And I would never think of myself as an oracle. Maybe an oracle, maybe an oracle in training somewhere down the road.
But I think I have so many friends of the inner critic sitting right on this team, and it's true. Anyway, so it's good that we can laugh about it, because there is strength to laughing about how seriously we take our egos and our identities. And noticing how when the pluses come and when we say, how sometimes when people are appreciating us, there's this look that we have on our face. And it's like, yeah, 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 I finally like, that's good. That's how good I am kind of look. And it's laugh worthy to understand how seriously we take those identities on either side when the positives come and when the negatives come. So all of this is an exercise around not concluding. We can accept the compliment because somebody was affected in some way through the work that we did. And we can thank the source, the divine, God, the universe, for giving us the gifts that we have in order to make something good happen. But at the same time, we don't have to necessarily conclude something that reinforces the ego's sense of this is what you should be.
Very helpful. So that's really clear on the positive side about the meaning we make of the compliment or the appreciation. And what about on the more critical side, the way that we typically think of the inner critic? So I'm sitting here thinking I'm not doing it. My inner critic's thinking I'm not doing a good enough job. I should be guiding it better. But we don't want to just throw that out completely, or else we won't actually believe the throwing out. So how can I look at the truth here?
Same thing, see what is true, right? And this is how we develop what you call equanimity. When the positives come, we look at the truth, but there is not necessarily an attribution to an identity around the positives. It's the same thing with the negatives. I look at the truth. I look at what does this want from me, and parse it out and be aligned to. And sometimes the truth may be, I could have done a better job. I truly could have done a better job. And sometimes the truth may be, I gave everything I had and I still was not able to meet the needs on the other side. Right? But you see, like both can be true, but the conclusion we draw from that is where things become very tricky. And so what we do, we don't draw any conclusion that reinforces, again, the message of the ego. We look at what is true and we do what is possible to address it.
All the pain comes from the identity piece. all the pain comes from I'm not who I think I should be. I'm not living up to my ego. We can't forget that. So the inner critic is ensnaring us by egging us on to become what our ego dictates we should be. And there are really these three functions. We were speaking about this a little bit earlier today, that there are really these three functions that we found through just exploring today for the inner critic. Those three functions are building up or inflating, egging on or provoking, and minimizing or criticizing. So when I'm inflating myself through my inner critic, or when my inner critic is inflating me, when my inner critic is provoking me, and when my inner critic is criticizing me, I have to watch out, because it's all the inner critic doing its work masterfully behind the scenes. And the number one teaching of the Bhagavad Gita is to get out of the game. The Bhagavad Gita is this wisdom text that has transformed our lives more than anything else, and which was the origins of Uphill, this teaching, the course on this work. The whole thing is get out of the game. Stop believing you're something you're not. And one of the ways that we have to do that is what Rasanath mentioned as developing equanimity. Become equal in happiness and distress, victory or defeat, honor and dishonor. And that is easier said than done. And we're really good at faking that or suppressing to convince ourselves that, yeah, I'm equal. I don't take it so seriously. I'm good. It's a deep thing. It's a lifelong journey to develop the real thing. And it takes such humility, such recognition. I am not my ego. I am something else. And then when my inner critic starts praising me, building me up, inflating me, I'm like, I'm on to you. I don't take that so seriously. It's nice that I did something which was received well. Good. I hope I can be an instrument in service. That's wonderful. And when I get the opposite reaction, this was not received well, you didn't meet the person's needs, now they're really disappointed. It's like, that's okay, that's hard. We still have hearts. That's not easy. But that doesn't say that I'm something of a person. It doesn't create a label for me that I get to then wear around. It's, I want to learn how I can be a more able instrument. And maybe I'm not meant to serve in this way, or maybe I'm not in touch with something that I need to see about myself. And then there's so many different paths that can go. And when the inner critic is egging me on and provoking me, if you want to keep that praise up that I'm giving you, if you want to keep those pluses going, then you better do A, B, and C. You better do it. I can question, do I really have to do those things? If they're for the sake of getting pluses from my inner critic so that I can stay enough or pretend that I'm enough, because I never really feel enough, is that really the game I want to play? And as our teachers, Don and Russ at the Enneagram Institute, would teach, and as we teach, and as we really want to anchor in this episode of the podcast, start with the pluses. Recognize that's the bait. When your inner critic is giving you the plus, that's the time to say, you know what, I'm not playing. It's not when I get the minuses. It's not when it starts criticizing me, because you're already in the game at that point. It's when you get the plus, that's like, oh, that's really nice. Now I've got you. Now I've got you. Step out at that point. Don't take it as, oh, that's so nice. I must be enough. No, you're something else. You're not your inner critic. You don't have to obey. You don't have to play the game.
Thank you for sharing that. We were talking a little bit before we started recording about how gambling was a good metaphor for this. And really where gambling gets you is when you start winning, because then you believe that okay, I got this. Like there's possibility here. And then when you start losing, there's always that recollection of what the winning was like. And that's where the addiction comes in.
Exactly.
The Gita talks about something that's so powerful in this regard, that, and it talks in terms of lust as an obsession for all the things that we want. And it talks about when lust is satisfied, it transforms into greed. And when it's not satisfied, it transforms into anger and frustration. So that's exactly what happens within a critic. The lust for the validation of an identity that I think I should be leads us to, when it's fulfilled, then more of it. And when it's not fulfilled, then the beating myself up, the anger, the frustration that arises from it. So there is no real good end to playing the game. Once we realize that, that doesn't mean the game stops immediately, but we are no longer invested in playing it the same way. And while sometimes we might find ourselves in the middle of the game, and we can say, no, I'm not playing it, retiring. And then over time, when we learn to do that, then even before the game starts, we can say, I'm not playing this game because I know where it goes. So it takes practice, just like with anything. It takes practice learning how to quit the game every time we discover we are in it.
And I love the visual that Don and Russ give of the 3-card Monty, or the shell game where you have cups. Somebody on the street has a little table with 3 cups and there's a shell under one of them, and they lift the cup and they show you where the shell is. And then they start moving the shell around and moving the cups around, and it's being hidden by these 3 different cups. Or the 3-card Monty, which is the same thing with cards, right? You see your card and then it's being shuffled amongst the 3. There's a kind of innocence where a child might be attracted and say, oh, I want to follow where the card is. I can do that. And it doesn't feel like it's such a big gamble. And it's not like playing the slot machine where you're completely at the mercy of randomness. It's like, no, I'll use my eyes. I'll follow this. And it's a good acuity test. It's a good game. It's innocent. But what happens is it's never quite as we think it will be. It always looks easier than it is. It feels like, yeah, I should be able to win this, but it's not like that. And Rasanath, you were reminding us of how when you play at a casino, they'll give you wins at first to get you locked in. They'll give you the wins. And somebody who's observing will think like, oh, I could totally win at this. Okay, now we got somebody else who wants to get in on it, right? It's a seduction. Don't be deceived. Don't be deceived. That's the real message. Don't be deceived by the pluses. That's the game. We don't have to play it.
Yeah, so some key takeaways here are the inner critic is always present. And when it's not present, that's when you need to worry, and you need to find out where it actually is present. And then critical to our discussion here, and the nuance that I found so striking from the workshop, is that we actually have to catch the pluses. Because when we're just focusing on the minuses, the classic version of the inner critic as this critical, minimizing voice, where it's already too late at that point because we're already playing the game. And so where we need to find it is when it is giving us those pluses, giving us those breadcrumbs, and really stand up and say, I'm not going to play this game.
You have to return the pluses back to the inner critic and say, I'm not playing this game, right? And that takes some strength. It takes courage to be able to do that. But yeah, there is no real inner work without that kind of courage.
And to make it even more practical in terms of takeaways, based on what both of you offered me when I shared my example of my inner critic, is that we don't want to make it mean anything about us. So if we're doing something good and somebody gives us praise, it's wonderful that this person is getting what they need and feeling fulfilled, but it doesn't mean something about me. And specifically, it doesn't mean that I'm more of my ego. And similarly, on the other side is when something isn't going my way or it's not working, there might be some truth that I'm not able to meet the needs of other people, or I'm not competent enough to offer what needs to be offered in this particular situation. But it also doesn't need to be taken to the level of a character flaw or some existential threat to who I am as a human being and to what I'm ultimately able to offer as a human being, which is my love and my humility and my gratitude, my appreciation for others, and my deeper knowing about myself.
See, the inner critic is producing an emotional reaction in us. And we may not even know that our inner critic is at work. As I was sharing, it's often that we're like, I had an encounter with my inner critic at some point, or like, I really felt my inner critic at this time. No, it's operating all the time. And anytime it's producing an emotion, happy or distressed, it's coming from the inner critic, unless we actively see it and step outside of it. That's the only way that it's not coming from that place, is when we're aware, when we bring consciousness to the unconscious plane of the game. And so I can recognize that I did something which touched somebody, and that's getting closer to who I really am. And I'm not dependent on my inner critic to validate that. I don't have to be tied to that. I'm not trying to create a worldly identity. I'm just trying to be who I am the best I can. I've got a long ways to go, and I'm grateful for the encouragement.
Beautiful, guys. Well, thank you so much for your time today and for sharing your wisdom as always, for being vulnerable, for offering yourselves and your own experiences as it relates to your own inner critics. And thank you for encouraging me along my path and helping me work with my inner critic, because it's been such a struggle. It still is such a struggle. And to have both of you alongside me as I go through that struggle has been life-changing. So thank you.
So beautiful. Thank you. Such a privilege on all accounts.
And thank you, everyone, for listening.
Thank you for listening to Upbuilding the Self. Upbuild is a leadership development company that offers workshops, coaching, and other services to help you on the path towards being your best self, free from the shackles of the ego. To learn more about our work, visit our website, upbuild.com, and sign up for our newsletter to gain access to podcasts, reflections, and upcoming events. If you enjoyed this episode, please go to iTunes to leave us a review so that others can find and benefit from the podcast. We look forward to being with you again next time.